This hearing of the Subcommittee on Biotechnology, Horticulture, and Research to review the federal coordination and response regarding pollinator health will come to order. At this point, I'd like to give my own opening statement. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome everyone to this hearing in which we will continue to examine the aspects of pollinator health. As many of you are aware, the Ag Committee has had a long interest in examining and promoting pollinator health. In both the 2008 and 2014 Farm Bills, provisions were included to authorize pollinator research and extension programs, improve capacity and infrastructure within the USDA to promote long-term pollinator health, and to authorize expanded surveillance of pests and diseases affecting pollinators. Following the passage of the 2014 Farm Bill, this subcommittee commenced an oversight process focusing on specific threats to pollinator health under the leadership of former Chairman Austin Scott. In a hearing held just over a year ago, we heard from public and private sector scientists. While there were many factors discussed contributing to pollinator health, one factor leading most lists was the threat associated with the parasitic mite known as the Varroa destructor. The lead bee researcher at USDA, Dr. Jeff Pettis, referred to this mite as a modern honeybee plague and suggested it has been responsible for the deaths of massive numbers of colonies both within the United States and worldwide. Nevertheless, despite the overwhelming consensus within the scientific community regarding the relative importance of the various factors contributing to overall pollinator health, the factor near the bottom of the scientific community's list seems to be the factor highest on the list of activist groups. Pesticides, and in particular a new family of pesticides known as neonics, seem to be attracting the lion's share of media and public interest attention. Neonics can be applied to the plant or used as a seed treatment. They are highly effective and have seen very rapid adoption rates among producers because of the significant benefits they offer. It is frustrating that efforts to innovate and employ new, proven technologies to enhance our ability to produce food, feed, and fiber are constantly under attack. Shortly after our hearing last year, the President issued an executive memorandum establishing a White House task force to review pollinator health. The main focus of the work was to be on expanding habitat for pollinators. I should note that the task force findings were supposed to be released at the end of 2014, but unfortunately 5 months later, we're still waiting on this report. The order also directed the various departments and agencies assigned to the task force to work together to develop a national pollinator health strategy. While coordination and communication were understood to be a central tenet of this executive order, only days after receiving the order, the National Wildlife Refuge System announced a ban on neonics and biotech plants without a single effort to communicate with either the USDA or the EPA and what their intentions and justifications were. I would note that the Secretary of Agriculture and Administrator of the EPA were appointed to co-chair the President's task force. As both agencies were completely caught off guard by this announcement, each expressed frustration with the lack of communication. We would reasonably expect, in light of this surprise announcement by an agency within the Department of Interior, the USDA and EPA would double down on their efforts to enhance federal coordination and communication. Unfortunately, just 2 months later, EPA released a study of the benefits of neonic seed treatment on soybeans with little to no input from the USDA. USDA's chief economist sent a letter to the EPA disagreeing with the assessment, referring to it as incomplete, premature, and unnecessarily burdensome to the task before farmers and ranchers to produce food, feed, and fiber for a strong and healthy America. That letter is in members' folders and will be made part of today's hearing record. Examples like this are why we fought so hard in the Farm Bill to give ag a seat at the table by when EPA is considering rules and regulations that would impact farmers. I expect EPA's Science Advisory Board to follow congressional intent and give farmers that voice so better policy can be made. Today, USDA and EPA both have a seat at the table, and I look forward to your testimony. And I'd like to now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Del Bene, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for calling this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here with us this afternoon. As the subcommittee undertakes our responsibility to examine pollinator health, It'll be important to understand as fully as possible the role that the seed treatments and other crop protectants play in growers' overall pest management decisions. In my view, there's no simple answer to the question of their value. Some growers may be justified in using the seed treatments, while others may find little or no need to do so. I do want to caution, though, about any of us reaching any conclusions from a single hearing. This issue is far too complex for talking points, and this issue demands our thoughtful and methodical attention, and I hope that we hold future hearings to further explore this complex issue. I hope that we'll get the opportunity to hear from beekeepers, fruit and vegetable growers, applied entomologists, and other experts in light of all the recent press focusing on the use of neonic seed treatments. I have to wonder why today's hearing did not include these parties, but instead is centered on what seems to be more of an insular issue between two federal agencies. And while I respect our witnesses' expertise, I believe members of the subcommittee would have been better served by first hearing from those on the ground and in the field. Those who must make, on an individual basis, thoughtful decisions on the use of crop protection chemistries. By focusing on the perception of a disagreement between agencies during an open and transparent public comment process, we reduce our oversight role to refereeing. The testimony provided by constituent witnesses, the beekeepers and growers who we represent, can help inform the policy decisions we make with administrative agencies. So my goal is to ensure that individual growers have the tools needed to make the best pest management decisions given their individual circumstances of crop, climate, and ecological sensitivity. So, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and I encourage future hearings on this important issue, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Del Bene. The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so the witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure that there is ample time for questions. The chair would like to remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority for members who were present at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of their arrival. I appreciate the members' understanding. Witnesses are reminded to limit their oral presentations to 5 minutes, and just like Chairman Conaway has been a stickler for that, we will be here too. All written statements will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the table. First off, Dr. Robert Johansson. He's the active chief economist with the USDA here in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Jim Jones, the assistant administrator, Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, Environmental, as part of the EPA. Dr. Johansson, please begin your testimony when ready.
Chairman Davis, Ranking Member Del Bene, and other members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be at today's hearing on the federal coordination and response regarding pollinator health. With more than 75% of flowering plants relying on pollinators, their health is important to USDA and to all of us consumers. The value of honey production in the U.S. has increased in volume and value terms by about 20% in 2014 relative to 2013, and that's from the USDA honey report that NASS does each year. That's been rising to 178.2 million pounds produced and 38.5 million respectively. The estimated value earned by honey producers in 2014 is more than double that of 1994, even adjusting for inflation. However, production volume is lower by about 18% relative to that year. The current average price of about $2.16 a pound is a record high, indicating the increasing value that U.S. consumers place on honey. U.S. imports of honey have also reached historic highs, doubling in volume between 2004 and 2013 to about 154,000 metric tons. U.S. honey producers are responding to those higher honey prices. The number of producing colonies and average production per colony grew from 2.6 million colonies producing 57 pounds per year in 2013 to 2.7 million colonies at 65 pounds per colony of production in 2014. Although there is still plenty of room for growth, in 1993 there were more than 3 million colonies producing at 73 pounds of production per colony. Furthermore, the rental fees that producers charge for pollination services continue to rise due to increasing demand for those services. The average rental rate per hive doubled between 2005 and 2009 to more than $150. Indeed, in 2012, the fees charged for honeybee pollination services exceeded $650 million. However, annual losses of colonies remain high, making it difficult to meet that rising demand for pollination services. Although the national trend data we currently have is limited, we know that beekeepers lost Roughly 34% of their colonies during 2013-14, and down from 45% the year before, but still very high. And of course, this morning's report on preliminary numbers for 2014-15 from the Bee Informed Partnership shows that losses of managed honeybee colonies were 23.1% for the 14-15 winter, down 6.6% from the previous year. However, for the first time, summer losses exceeded winter losses, making annual losses for the year a very high 42.1%. To promote the health of honeybees and other pollinators, President Obama issued his June 20th, 2014 memorandum, as you had mentioned, Chairman, charging federal departments and agencies with taking steps to help restore pollinator populations. The federal government is poised to lead in this effort, given its broad national perspective and ability to identify and prioritize goals and programs that extend beyond state and national borders. Understanding the federal government cannot act alone in promoting pollinator protection, the President also identified the need for public-private partnerships, as well as increasing citizen engagement. To accomplish that effort, the President created the Pollinator Health Task Force, co-chaired by, as you noted, the Secretary of USDA and the Administrator of EPA. USDA has a rich history in partnering with other federal agencies and numerous stakeholders in recognizing that the collaborative effort is much more effective in achieving success. And USDA agencies are providing important contributions to the protection of pollinators. Our research agencies, including ARS, NIFA, ERS, and NAS, conduct and support that research. The Office of Pest Management Policy coordinates our pest management work across the department with EPA. And APHIS conducts a national survey of honeybee pests and diseases and collaborates with others on ways to manage and suppress and eradicate pests and diseases. Our conservation programs, including those managed by FSA and NRCS, support pollinator habitat across the country, and the U.S. Forest Service supports outreach, technology transfer, and pollinator habitat. The Office of the Chief Economist will typically be asked to review and analyze issues that may fall under the purview of those activities. Such review and analysis may occur as a normal part of the operation of my office. As such, I will describe some of our responsibilities, providing some examples of how we interact with EPA and their activities. The main mission of my office is to advise the Secretary of Agriculture on the economic prospects of ag markets and on the economic implications of policy and programs affecting U.S. food and fiber production and rural areas, to ensure the public has consistent, objective, and reliable agricultural forecasts, and to promote effective and efficient rules governing USDA programs. Areas of major analysis include international trade agreements, risk-sharing institutions, crop insurance, commodity programs, developments in commodity markets, sustainable development, and ag labor. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to note just a couple areas of coordination with EPA, and certainly my testimony is submitted for the record for those members that wish to review that. USDA collaborates with EPA on a number of key issues, such as the Federal Pollinator Health Task Force. Many offices within USDA have established working relationships with EPA that date back to the agency's founding. My office in particular coordinates review of USDA and other agencies' significant rulemakings and has a long history of collaboration with EPA on those issues. An example is the work that we did on the Ag Worker Protection Standard last year. We provided input into that process as part of the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA. EPA must provide the Secretary of Agriculture a copy of the rule and give USDA the opportunity to review and comment. I'll also note that we also work with EPA on a number of issues, including the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. And with that, I'll conclude just to note that I thank you for inviting me to provide some perspective on pollinator issues, as well as the role of the Office of the Chief Economist. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Johansson. Mr. Jones, feel free to give your opening testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Davis, Ranking Member Delbene, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jim Jones, and I serve as the Assistant Administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, which is the office that's responsible for federal pesticide regulation in the United States. Pollinator protection is an extremely high priority for the EPA. Over the past several years, we have taken many steps to develop scientifically sound analytical techniques for assessing the potential impacts of pesticides on pollinators, and have acted based on this science to reduce those exposures determined to be of most significant risk. As the science continues to advance through the registration review programs, the agency will continue to work with stakeholders to put in place any additional mitigation strategies to continue to protect pollinators. As you well know, pollinators are responsible for nearly 1 in every 3 bites of food you eat. In addition, they contribute nearly $15 billion to the nation's economy. Losses of our pollinator populations have the potential to not only threaten agricultural production, but to also threaten natural plant communities and important services provided by ecosystems. Researchers studying pollinator health have been unable to identify a single cause for pollinator declines and have concluded that losses of honeybee colonies are likely the result of a complex interaction of a number of stressors. In May 2013, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the EPA released a comprehensive scientific report on honeybee health. This report synthesized the current state of knowledge regarding the primary factors that scientists believe have the greatest impact on managed bee health. These factors include exposures to pests and pathogens, poor nutrition due to decreased availability of high-quality forage, exposure to pesticides, and bee biological genetics and breeding. Each play a role in impacting managed bee health and likely also impact the health of native pollinators. It is because of these many factors and in light of the emerging science that in June 2014, President Obama established the Pollinator Health Task Force, co-chaired by USDA and EPA. In the very near future, the strategy developed by the task force will be released and is the result of a strong interagency collaboration with a focus on improving pollinator health and increasing pollinator habitat. Of all the stressors impacting pollinators, the EPA has a role to play in 2 areas. First, ensuring that new and existing products do not cause unreasonable adverse effects to pollinators. And second, registering new products for beekeepers to use in controlling hive pests such as varroa mites. Pesticides play a critical role in agricultural production and the health of our society. Pesticides can also lead to adverse ecological and human health consequences. Congress has entrusted EPA to balance the risks and benefits of pesticide use. Mitigating the effects of pesticide on bees, many of which are intended to kill insects, is a difficult task, but is also a priority for the federal government, as both bee pollination and insect control are essential to the success of agriculture. The EPA is working to reduce bees' exposure to pesticides without losing the ability to control pests in agriculture. Certain pesticides are also important pest management tool for beekeepers to control the varroa mite or hive beetles. This is an inherently difficult goal to achieve, since the pesticides, such as those intended to control varroa mites on bees, essentially seek to control the mite while not harming the bee colony. To achieve these goals, EPA has focused its pollinator efforts in 3 primary areas: advancing the science and understanding of the potential impact of pesticides on pollinators; secondly, taking appropriate risk management actions based upon the available science; and third, collaborating with domestic and international partners to advance pollinator protection. In the near future, as part of the rollout of the Pollinator Health Strategy, the EPA will soon announce additional initiatives for continuing to improve pollinator health. We will take these actions based upon the best available science and utilizing our longstanding principles of public engagement and transparency. The EPA will also continue to work with USDA and other federal and state agencies to protect pollinators while ensuring that growers can meet their pest control needs in order to maintain a diverse ecosystem and provide for a healthy and abundant United States food supply. And I'm happy to answer any questions from the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. In light of the fact that they're about ready to call a vote, it looks like it'll be one vote. When it happens, I will make sure that we stand in recess, and we'll come back here and continue the line of questioning. But I know one of our members actually has to go to a markup immediately following the vote, so I'm going to yield my first 5 minutes to my colleague, Mr. Molinar from Michigan, to ask the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate Dr. Johansson and Mr. Jones. Appreciate you being here testifying today and for your focus. I just wanted to ask first, when you talk about releasing a strategy, do you have a timeline for that?
I think we're talking about something within the next several weeks, so it will not be much longer.
Okay, thank you. And as part of the process, I'm assuming that there would be a communication strategy of broadly communicating that. Will that be part of that strategy?
That's correct.
Okay. If I could, I'd also, your role is regarding chemical safety and pollution prevention. And we're talking about pesticides, but also herbicides. Would that be part of your area?
Yeah, so my office is responsible for pesticide regulation at the federal level in the United States, and pesticides are defined under the law as herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides, basically anything designed to kill a pest.
Okay, gotcha. One of the things I wanted to ask your input on, recently the International Agency on the Review of Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization, announced classification of glyphosate as a 2A category probable carcinogen. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, sir.
Conclusion? Okay. It seems that that conclusion contradicts other parts of the World Health Organization, which have reviewed glyphosate and found no evidence of being a carcinogen, and then other regulatory bodies around the world have reviewed this also. And I understand that the EPA prepared a death statement on, and found in 2014 after reviewing 55 epidemiological studies on the possible cancer and non-cancer effects of glyphosate that does not warrant any changes in the EPA's cancer classification. And I guess the reason I bring this up is, A, do you still, given the report that they had, are they in communication with you on this, recognizing your conclusions with the EPA?
The IARC operates independent of, certainly of the United States government, and I think of any other government in the world. We're making sure that we're looking at everything that they looked at before we finalize, well, it's not final, put a draft assessment, which we're going to do in the July timeframe. But we've collaborated with our colleagues in Canada in the development of our assessment. So we're making sure that we are looking at everything that they looked at. I can say, as a matter of fact, that the body of information that was in front of us is much larger than the body of information that was in front of the IARC.
Mm-hmm. So you would stand by your conclusions in spite of what they've concluded and based on a broader assessment?
Our conclusions, which will be released in the July timeframe, we will definitely be standing behind.
Okay, thank you. And in the next few weeks, you expect to release your strategy, and it will be based on the sound science approach that you're using in other areas?
That's correct.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to advise members that a series of votes has been called. I anticipate the series of votes to last as long as it takes to get you to the floor and back. So it should be a very quick series of votes, and as long as we get back here, we'll call the hearing back in order. I would ask that you return quickly so that we can get it going again. This hearing will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair. Committee on Biotechnology, Horticulture, and Research will come to order. As we left off, again, welcome Dr. Johansson, Mr. Jones. We'll give folks a couple seconds to sit down since I don't think anybody thought we would start the hearing again with only 2 members. But we like to be timely. And ironically, the next questioner is sitting in her chair. So I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Ms. Del Bene, for her round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Jones, can you describe for the committee the benefits of moving EPA's pesticide risk assessment process for bees and for other insect pollinators from a qualitative to a quantitative risk assessment process?
Thanks, Congresswoman. So one of the issues that came up as we began to observe the attention being paid to the neonicotinoids was that our assessment wasn't capturing the kinds of exposures a honeybee in particular could get from neonicotinoid exposures, because the chemicals they behave in the environment significantly differently than many of the alternatives. And so we developed a way to allow us to quantitatively assess the risk associated with this class of chemistry to honeybees through the design of a particular study. So it will allow us to speak with greater confidence and less uncertainty as it relates to the impact of these compounds on honeybees.
And it's my understanding that the EPA has begun to employ the new risk assessment framework for bees as part of its regulatory decision-making process for all pesticide chemistries. And is that correct?
That's correct. We deploy the framework for all chemistries. Many chemistries, however, will not trigger the higher tiered studies because of their properties, but we'll at least think about how those other chemicals, whether the relevance of this new framework is to other pesticides, so it won't just be neonicotinoids.
And Dr. Johansson's report characterizes EPA's October 2014 analysis as that of an incomplete risk assessment. Now, it seems that EPA simply conducted a literature review whose data could inform the risk assessment process. Would that be a correct characterization of what you did?
Well, it was a benefits analysis as opposed to, so we were looking at the benefits of the chemical as opposed to what risk it poses. So we weren't at all attempting to characterize the risk of the compounds. We were attempting to characterize the benefits. And we got a fair amount of comment from USDA and from many others about what they saw, what that was right about it or was wrong about it.
And so what happens now with all of that comment? Where do you go from there?
So we will give consideration to all of the comments that we received, which included field visits. I personally went to the Delta at the request of soybean growers there to look at their experiences. We'll incorporate all of that into our final assessment, and then we will bring that together with a risk assessment for purposes of risk management.
And can you talked about this a little bit in your testimony. Can you put into perspective in real world terms how important pollinators are to our food supply? My district is a specialty crop district. We have lots of fruits and vegetables and red raspberries in particular, highest producer per capita. So what in real terms would the continued decline and loss of pollinators mean for our food supply and for our ecosystems?
That may be a question better answered by Dr.
Absolutely.
Johansson, but they're of critical importance to agriculture and to American consumers. But
Dr. Johansson, you have to push the button. There you go.
Certainly we know that pollinators are important for a good number of crops. For example, as you mentioned, specialty crops in particular, a lot of tree crops in California, for example, rely 100% on pollinator services. And so I think there's been a range of evaluations on the actual dollar amount that those contribute to U.S. agriculture as a value-added component. I think I mentioned earlier in my testimony that the service fees alone are roughly $650 million in 2012. And I think Jim had mentioned that some valuations had gone up upwards of $50 billion. Certainly we would say I've seen estimates anywhere in the range of $15 to $20 billion per year in terms of the value of the crops that are pollinated by pollinators. And so putting an actual value on, or how you go about estimating the economic value, you'd need to look into a variety of factors such as alternatives to pollination and that kind of thing and sort of net that out. But just from a ballpark standpoint, we would say that certainly pollinators are providing large value added to the U.S. Ag economy.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Del Bene. I'd like to now recognize Mr. Scott from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a couple of comments before I get into the questions. And while I certainly don't blame each of you individually, but it shouldn't take a congressional committee or a presidential directive for the USDA and the EPA to work on an issue of this magnitude. There was a lot of talk as we were getting started in the testimonies about honey, but the fact of the matter, it's pollination that's the real issue for our food supply. I like honey, and bees are known for honey, but it's really the pollination issue that is the importance to our food supply. So I would hope that in the future it wouldn't take Congress or the President to get the agencies to work together on these issues. And the second thing I would ask or suggest is that honeybees and pesticides, those aren't mutually exclusive issues, and I guess I have concerns, if you will, when we talk about the neonicotinoids and other things, that they're becoming, if you will, somewhat the whipping boy here, when the pesticides really aren't. That's not the primary issue. That's the problem. So the varroa mite is, in my opinion, one of the biggest problems. And my question for you, Mr. Jones, what is the EPA doing to make sure that we have the tools to combat that pest that has been so devastating to our bee colonies?
Thank you, Congressman. So our role here is to make sure that when we get an application for a varroa mite control product, that we expedite our review of it. And we actually have a really good example of that in the last 9 months, where researchers at the Department of Agriculture determined that a chemical that had been used for other things, oxalic acid, had the potential to control varroa mite in honeybee hives and not harm the bee. And so we worked with them on developing an application that they then submitted to us, and within several months we had licensed it. And so that oxalic acid is on the market today after a rather short period of time from discovery of its potential as a varroa mite control and licensing.
All right, so I appreciate that expedited approval, but what we call a discovery, the fact of the matter is that was already being used in Canada, I believe, for this very issue, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
And so it's not really a discovery, it's the fact that other countries were already using this, and we, if I remember correctly, we actually used the research from Canada on that particular pesticide, or whatever we want to call it, that attacks the varroa mite, to approve it. And I would just hope that we would be able to continue to expedite those things. What is the current estimate of the bee population in the cultivated bee populations and the wild bee populations?
I happen to know for managed bees that the number, which the Department of Agriculture number, is about 2.7 million managed bee colonies in the United States. I don't believe any of us know the wild populations. I don't know that they're surveyed.
Yeah. Be hard to count them, wouldn't it? That doesn't mean that certain agencies don't try to count other things and make up some numbers from time to time. How does it in the managed area compare to recent historic levels?
My understanding is that the managed colony numbers they're actually up a little bit over the last 5 years, from 2.5 million to 2.7 million, but that in the 1940s, they were as high as 6 million managed bee colonies, and as recently as the early 80s, it was around 3 million. So overall, the trend is they're down. They seem to have stabilized, and there's a small uptick.
All right, thank you. Mr. Hanson, do you have anything to add to those?
No, those are the numbers that you could see from looking at the NASS honey reports. You can pull out of there the number of colonies right now. As Jim had mentioned, there's the most recent report documents 2.7 million colonies. Last year there was 2.6, so a slight increase, but certainly in previous years was much higher than that. We would expect that as the evaluation of, as you mentioned, pollination services goes up over time, you would expect producers to respond by trying to increase that number.
Does the USDA keep any estimates of wild bee populations?
We can certainly get back to you on that. I have seen some in some of the preparation I did, but I don't have the number on the top of my head, and I would hesitate to try to dig through these papers to try and find it for you.
I'd be interested in the estimates and what they've done historically. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize that I used 40 seconds of your time.
I'll get him back at the next subcommittee hearing that you're chairing.
That's fine.
I'd like to now recognize my colleague from Florida, Mr. Yoho, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I appreciate you being here. What I'd like to bring out in this hearing is clarification and the purity of science and the purpose of science, and not have agendas driven by one side or the other, that your decisions in the EPA and the USDA are based factual on science. Because if we don't have that in your agency, what we have is mob rule, or we have, the media hysteria that goes on that drives things that'll affect, say, one of the large box retail stores because of media hype, in the respect that they think that neonics are bad or insecticides are bad, but yet when you look at all the benefits that we've gotten over the years, it outweighs the bad. And you guys are obviously there to protect us and the environment and things within the environment, but it has to be based on pure science. And what I read here is disturbing, in that the EPA is moving to rule before the studies are done. And what I want to ask you is, do we have assessed values of neonics in the nectar of a flower that is toxic to a bee? What level is that, Mr. Jones?
Thanks, Congressman. We have not finished the risk assessment process for neonics and their potential risks in bees. A part of doing that is understanding exposure, and a part of evaluating that exposure is to get good estimates around the amount of neonic in honey, in nectar, in pollen and in nectar, because that's how a bee can be, one of the ways a bee can be exposed.
Well, coming from the state of Florida, we have the University of Florida there with IFAS, which does a fantastic job in research. What they're finding out is and I'm sure you're aware of what's going on in Florida with our citrus trees. We've got about 90 to 95% of the citrus trees in Florida are affected with the HBL virus, and it's decimated our population of citrus trees. And without the use of neonics, we will have no citrus in Florida. And Florida without citrus trees is like wall without mart. It doesn't work. And the neonics have been proven that if you give them 3 weeks prior to the blooming stage of the plant, that they're very effective at stopping citrus greening. And yet the levels of the neonics in the nectar measured is less than 20 parts per million, which is what is deemed toxic for the bee. It's well below that. So a strategic spraying and application of a product is what's beneficial for the citrus tree, as it is for other crops. And when I look at the honeybee population in the world, I've got a study right here in front of me. If you look from 1960 to 2010, the amount of beehives, they've gone from 50 million beehives to now they're right at 80 million beehives worldwide. And when you look at when neonics were introduced, there was a decline in that era, but it was before neonics were introduced into the environment. And our populations have gone up. And then when we look at the stress that are on the bees, when you look at California has to import a lot of their bees, or they have to transport them long ways, or other parts of the country, the stress factor along with the mites and the viruses seem to play more of a relationship when you look at the correlation of stress on the hives, management of the hives, and the contamination. When you bring in outside population of bees, it's like children and horses. When you move them together, they're going to pick up exogenous strains of viruses that affect them. And I think we need to put more emphasis on that in that research, because if we look at just Canada, I think they have roughly 16 million acres of canola, and they don't have a decline in bee population. Of course, they don't have the varroa mites, but they've been using neonics steadily for the last 20 years. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, a couple things. First, I'd like to recognize that we authorized the use of the neonics in Florida citrus because of the exact scenario that you described. So we're very familiar with the issues that they're having. We are committed to using sound science in making the regulatory decisions that we do around neonics. Most of the grief that we get is because we haven't canceled the neonics, not because we're not following a science-based process. And I think that you're referring to Australia as opposed to Canada. Canada is suffering some of the same bee issues that we are. Australia, from the accounts that I've gotten, has not, and Australia does not have the varroa mite, at least as of yet.
The reports I have right now is that Canada, with their canola fields, roughly 16 million acres, their bee population's doing well, and their honey production's doing fine. It hasn't seen a dip, unless I'm wrong on
No,
it.
I think, actually, I'm sorry, the eastern Canada has had bee population issues that are similar to the United States, and western Canada has not.
All right, and I'll reserve my questions for the second go-round there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Now I'd like to recognize my colleague from Washington, Mr. Newhouse, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for being here about this important subject. I'm a fruit producer, so I understand fully the importance of honeybees to our way of life and to our ability to produce food, but also a user of some of these classes of chemicals. And I might add that they've been very successful in allowing us to control very problem pests very economically, and have gone a long ways to actually reducing the amount of sprays that we apply. So I think we can find a balance here at some point. But just a couple of questions, I guess probably with Mr. Jones first, if I might. As I am a producer, I'm interested in this subject. Would you say that there are any investigations or statistics that about negative impacts on bee health that are correlated to the misuse of pesticides, contrary to label requirements and recommendations?
There certainly, Congressman, have been a number of incidents associated with the misuse of pesticides. One that's gotten a lot of the attention from the state just south of yours in Oregon. And they're easily predicted. If you misuse an insecticide, that you may kill insects that you're not intending to kill. And that is something that we have seen where, in the case in Oregon, neonicotinoids, but it frankly could have been any insecticide, were applied to linden trees while tens of thousands of bumblebees were in that tree. The label said it shouldn't be used that way, but it was used that way, and yep, big surprise, all the bumblebees in that tree, or most of them, died. And so I think we've got a lot of evidence that if you misuse an insecticide in a way where insects are present that you didn't want to inadvertently kill, you will see deaths, in that case, bee deaths.
So I guess where I'd like to probe a little further, how much are we working on enforcing those existing rules, those existing label restrictions, versus coming up with perhaps new rules? Shouldn't we be doing the former before the latter?
Well, as a former commissioner of an ag department, I would expect you to know that pesticide use in the United States is enforced by state ag departments, with the exception of a couple of states where it's done by the Environment Agency, which is California and New York. So I would turn to my state NASDA colleagues to answer that question.
I appreciate that, and I do understand. A growing number of municipalities and even several states around the country are banning the use of this class of chemicals. I understand the EPA's regulatory decisions are based on analysis from numerous hundreds of staff reviewing available data. In your estimation, do these states and cities have the expertise and staff resources to be making these kinds of decisions?
You know, I wouldn't speculate on the capacity of states or local governments to make some of the choices that are being made. I think that one of the reasons people are frustrated with our time schedule is that we've not finished our review, which is why we're expediting the review of the neonicotinoids, so that municipalities, states, and others can have the benefit of EPA's risk assessment.
So follow up to that, and similarly, when retailers may have questions about a product and how or why it may be approved, do you explain that approval process? and the requirements that you impose on those companies?
So when we're asked, it's usually by municipality. That's the entity that most often asks, can we come and explain to them how we do our work? We always provide that kind of technical assistance. I'm not aware of, it doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but I'm just not aware of a retailer having asked for our views on a pesticide regulatory issue.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
You just yielded back the 40 seconds Chairman Scott took, so thank you.
We're even.
Yes, I'll let him know that. I'd like to now recognize my colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you for this hearing. Incredibly important topic in the world of agriculture, and quite frankly, everyone that likes food. So, scientific research really is the key to protecting and sustaining pollinator health. And there is already so much research occurring between the USDA, the EPA, and other land-grant universities. I'm a little concerned, though, to some degree, that this research is being done in silos, and that we haven't maximized the full synergistic benefits through collaboration. That maybe at times there's little to no coordination between these various entities. Institutions such as my alma mater, Penn State Land-Grant University, which I know is doing a considerable amount of pollinator research, and with federal resources would be a great partner, especially given their existing work with extension activities. So my question is, of the two agencies that you both respectively represent, does USDA or EPA intend to move forward with any kind of national pollinator institute to help bridge these connections and better coordinate efforts, and quite frankly, in a synergistic way, get to some good solutions sooner than later?
Thanks, Congressman. So, we are coordinating with our colleagues at the Department of Agriculture on pollinator-related issues very closely, and with your alma mater, Penn State. I'm forgetting the name of the entomologist there, who has been very active in our collective collaboration, as well as many other land-grant researchers. I'm not aware of any, at least on the EPA's part, of standing up a pollinator institute of any nature. Defer to Rob.
Certainly, we can follow up with you on this question in terms of our work with the land grants. I know that we've certainly requested additional budget resources for some of our research agencies, which do collaborate pretty strongly with institutions like Penn State. So, for example, both NASS, ARS, and NIFA have we've requested additional funds specifically for pollinators, but I'm not aware of that being targeted towards a specific institute.
My question, I'd be real curious to get both your respective professional opinions, and how would you feel about an initiative that would stand up such a national pollinator institute?
I'll defer to Dr. Johansson, as I think that the broader issues of pollinators are more in USDA's bailiwick as opposed to just the pesticide.
Well, that's a great question. I would like to hypothetically think about that and get back to you on that. Certainly, I think there has been, pollinator research stations that we've had in the past that have been part of the Extension Service and collaborating at places such as LSU, and I know that some of those have had budgetary issues in the past that we're trying to, boost now, and I think that would go a long way towards answering your question, but I need to get some specifics from our Office of Budget and Policy Analysis on that. Thanks.
That'd be great, I'd welcome input from both agencies. I think, obviously, I think we're all very aware of the potential risk with, any kind of impairment to pollinators, and love to talk with you and your agencies more about. I recognize that obviously we're doing some isolated, some targeted collaboration, but this really, I think, the potential risk here warrants perhaps a little broader collaboration. wanted to just quickly, I know that the chief of the National Wildlife Refuge issued a unilateral moratorium on January 26 prohibiting agricultural practices on refuge property that employ the use of biotechnology and neonic pesticides. There were no independent reviews conducted documenting specific health risks to humans or wildlife, nor was any discussion held between the refuge system and the agencies responsible for review and regulation of these technologies. I guess my question, Ms. Jones, is with the July 17th, where the Fish and Wildlife Service announced that it was banning the use of nicotinoids on U.S., how'd I do, Chairman, with pronunciation with that? Pretty good?
Terrible.
Okay. Was everything I learned from him, so, you know. Was EPA consulted by the Fish and Wildlife Service regarding this decision, and what guidance did the EPA offer if it did?
We were not consulted on that decision.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Since everyone here has gone through a round of questioning, now the witnesses are stuck with my round of questioning. But first, being the chairman of the subcommittee, I always enjoy hearing about other land-grant universities and the positive research that's being done there, but none can compare to the land-grant university, the University of Illinois. And I see we have fans in the back. Thank you. University of Illinois has been at the center of pollinator research. Dr. May Berenbaum was awarded the National Science Award for her research in pollinator issues. And I'm proud that what we see here today is a collaboration on research that is very important to this issue happening at many of our land-grant universities, which is why I'm so proud of the subcommittee and the members that are on the subcommittee, because we have issues that affect the agricultural communities as a whole, and we have research being done at our facilities within our districts, and we're able here today to talk about how that research is being utilized by the federal agencies who, at this point, are partners in releasing a report that, as I said in my opening statement, is 5 months behind. I guess I'll start with that question. Does anybody have an idea at the table, Dr. Johansson, as to when this may come out, maybe next week?
Well, I think Jim had mentioned that we're expecting that to come out in the next couple of weeks. I've heard spring, and obviously spring is in DC is a loosely defined term. I think we may already be past spring in DC, but certainly I think we're expecting that to come out sooner than later, and I'll let Mr. Jones fill in the blanks on more specifics.
We're a couple of weeks away, and the report will be publicly released.
Great. I'll hold you to it. All right, first question I have is for Dr. Johansson. I'm sure you've read recent media reports regarding allegations of scientific suppression within the USDA. Have you ever felt pressure to modify your conclusions or to keep them from the public?
Speaking personally, no, I have not. I've certainly, as a young researcher, felt that the peer review process was maybe sometimes a little slow for my desires, wanting to get publications out into journals and what have you. But I think for the most part, speaking from an economics perspective, all the peer review that we put in place is intended just to make sure that the research that's being done is sufficient quality and rigor for publication in scientific and academic journals or for presentations at professional meetings. And so based on that experience, I have not ever felt that any kind of research findings of mine or anybody in my office have been adversely impacted by this review process that we typically try and put in place just to ensure that the research that is getting put out is of high enough quality for use to the public.
And for this committee, can you briefly outline the process that you use for USDA scientists' work and the peer review process that it goes through before publication?
Sure. I think each office in USDA approaches this differently depending on the kind of science that's being done. And so I certainly don't want to speak for those other agencies that have developed their processes that are and protocols that are specific to the type of research that they're undertaking. For our process, I can speak to a couple aspects of that. Our office provides advice to the secretary, and that is generally typically for just internal consumption, and so we often have to put that together relatively quickly and get that up to his office. And he relies on our professional experience to provide the best available information available to him at that time. So that doesn't necessarily have any sort of rigorous protocol that we have to go through to get that up to him. But on the other hand, as part of my office, we have the World Agricultural Outlook Board that coordinates all of our estimates for the world agricultural supply and demand that we put out each month. That process is very tightly determined by protocols that we put in place specifically to keep those analysts protected from any kind of what may even be perceived as outside interference from any political or questioning or alterations of their findings. And so I would just point out that at least the protocols that are in our office are intended essentially to make sure that our analysts are able to put out to the public the best available information available.
So the reports that there has been suppression due to political motives, they're wrong?
Oh, like I said, I'm not really familiar with those reports. I haven't been involved with that issue. I know we've developed a scientific integrity policy at the department that's intended to provide guidance and discuss these issues. We can certainly get that information to you, but I haven't been involved with any reports of any kind of suppression of USDA science results.
Okay, so do you equate the need to follow set protocols with this allegation of political suppression that you say doesn't exist?
It certainly doesn't exist in my office or with the work that we've been doing.
Okay.
Certainly can't comment, like I said, on other agencies.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'm going to yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Florida, Mr. Yoho.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to continue on, I guess, the working together as the EPA and USDA so that we do come out with sound science. Mr. Jones, you were talking in your testimony, there were 3 areas that you try to achieve. Achieve these goals, the EPA has focused its pollinator efforts in 3 primary areas: advancing the science and understanding of the potential impacts of pesticides on pollinators, taking appropriate risk management actions based on that available science, and collaborating with domestic and international partners to advance pollinator protection. And we all agree how important bees are in the pollination process, in the development or the production of our fruits and vegetables. To have that sound science, working with the USDA, I've also got here the National Wildlife Refugee System bans neonics and biotechs without justifying or communicating with the USDA or the EPA. And on October 2014, EPA releases a study on neonics talking about the treatments. I'm sure you're aware of the soybean seeds, that there was little or no overall benefits to production, and the USDA comes out and disagrees with that assessment and calls that risk assessment incomplete. How do we get you guys on the same page, working for a common goal instead of fighting against each other, or not communicating against each other? Dr. Johansson, what's your thoughts on that? What would it take to get it where you're working together on that?
Well, I certainly would agree that Jim and I are certainly open to working together collaboratively on, certainly on economic analysis that his office is undertaking to discuss the benefits or the economics behind a lot of these treatments, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to follow up with his office on those moving forward. And, just to point out, we do a lot of collaborating on a lot of issues, and sometimes we just wanted to, in this case, wanted to make sure that that we did provide comments on this, and we took the opportunity to put those in the public record. I wouldn't necessarily call it squabbling or anything like that. It was just that we wanted to make sure that our comments were heard.
Mr. Jones, what's your thoughts on working with the USDA? I mean, how can we help facilitate you guys working closer together so that when we do come out with a policy, it's got the stamp and approval of the USDA, the EPA, the United States government, and it's factual, not based on an agenda, and it's not being politically motivated or outside groups motivated. What can we do to get beyond that and just on pure science?
We're committed to basing our decisions on science and following the rule of law, and we collaborate extensively with the Department of Agriculture. As a matter of fact, in the mid-90s, when there was concern that we might be running amok in pesticide regulation, the department set up an Office of Pest Management Policy, which is our point of contact on any issue, pesticide regulatory or science, and that's our point of entry into the department, and we coordinate and collaborate on virtually every move we make that's of significant note. But we can always do better, and we're committed to doing better and making sure that we're as coordinated as we can be. If we were to issue actually a certain regulations, which the benefits assessment was not, we actually have a statutory responsibility to consult with the secretary, and we do that. We've done that on the worker protection standard, the current certification and training standard, but that was not a regulation. But we still went through the Office of Pest Management Policy and would be committed to doing that going forward.
I would encourage you guys, to get the results of that report out as soon as we can so we can bring some stability to the market so that we don't have the big box stores not using a neonic because they say, the public perception is these are bad. And it brings me back to the trade deal coming up that we're looking at with the European Union and what the European Union did, banning the use of the neonics or a 2-year moratorium on it. And now it's spilled over to Canada, and it was, let's see, after the European Commission voted to ban neonics, anti-GMO green and farm groups turned their focus on Canada, pressuring Ottawa to follow suit. The responsible agency, Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory, aware that the evidence fingering neonics was spotty, vacillated, issuing an ambiguous assessment of the reported bee deaths in Ottawa. And we don't want that driving our policies because now if we're using those products here, we're going to be banned from trading with Europe on that, and it's not based on science, it's based on a political agenda. And if it's truth behind that, I don't have a problem, but if it's not based on science, and that's what we rely on you guys, and I know you guys are going to do a great job because you got the USDA working right hand in hand with you, and it'll make American farmers stronger with our bees. Thank you.
Gentlemen's time has expired. Thank you. Now, I'd like to recognize, actually, let me jump in real quick and follow up a little bit on the discussion that was just had. Part of the reason why both of you are sitting here is because we have a concern that there isn't the communication between the two agencies within the same administration, co-chairing the Pollinator Task Force. And the evidence is clear in the letter that we have submitted for the record. Dr. Johansson, were you surprised at the EPA's action here? And can you actually elaborate a little bit more on your letter and the USDA's disagreement with EPA and how to better coordinate as co-chairs of this task force?
Well, certainly I think on your latter question that the task force is being, I think there's great communication and great collaboration between the two agencies and moving forward on that. I'm not integrally involved with the task force. We do, as I mentioned earlier, review certain pieces of research or analysis that may come out of that task force at some later date for its economic content. In the case of the study that EPA had conducted on the benefits of seed treatments for soybean producers, I think I wouldn't classify it as a huge disagreement. I think EPA acknowledged that there were some open questions that they needed to get more data on. They wanted to get public comment on that. I think we agreed with that and emphasized places that we thought that the public could provide good data, particularly with respect to acknowledging the sort of heterogeneity that you get in egg production across the United States. Different regions have different growing practices, different challenges, and certainly the economics of the situation may be different in any given year. Certainly, we would also, which didn't come into play in this particular analysis, there are benefits to different types of producers, different crops, as had been pointed out by Congressman Yoho and Congressman Newhouse. Those weren't addressed in this analysis, and certainly moving forward, we would expect that looking at the benefits of seed treatments will be, or the use of this type of chemical pesticide will be different by region, by crop, by time of year, and I think that's essentially the point we were trying to make in those comments.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And keep in mind, the ranking member Del Bene talked about why couldn't we have more stakeholders in the pollinator issue and the colony collapse disorder issue sitting at the table with you. Well, we don't have a task force report. It's 5 months late. Otherwise, we would have had those stakeholders sitting at the table. But what we see as an oversight institution is we see a disagreement between agencies that are supposed to be working together. This is what frustrates us, and this is the reason why both of you are here, because hopefully your presence, you could take our messages back to your superiors at your respective agencies and let them know that we want to see that communication. We want to work with you. We want to address these issues based upon clear science. And we have so many examples that have come up today of institutions that are willing and doing the work on pollinator research to help you with. But let's make sure that we have that communication within our own agencies. And again, I like to take this opportunity to ask you, Mr. Jones, to take a message back to Administrator McCarthy that I talked to her about. Let's get a member of the ag community on your EPA Science Advisory Board. And let me be clear on the congressional intent of that, since I wrote the provision. I don't want somebody that just has scientific ag research, a scientific ag research background. Let's get somebody who's actually out in the fields on that science advisory board so that we can put a seat at the table that has real agricultural experience. I'm not saying what type. I mean, obviously, Central Illinois is home to corn and soybeans. I call them the special crops, not the specialty crops. But we have so many opportunities to work together, and the reason you're here today is I hope you take that message back. So with that, I'm going to recognize my colleague from Washington for 5 more minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And coming from a state that raises some of those specialty crops, the state of Washington, if I could, in a related line of questioning, Mr. Jones, let me relate some frustrations from some of the stakeholders in my district as it relates to registering pesticides with the EPA. I'd like your response to some of their concerns. They've reported to me that despite submitting ample independent evidence concerning the impacts of their products, that sometimes the agency will pick fewer independent standalone studies, sometimes that lack raw data to formulate their decisions, and then make registration tolerance decisions based on that instead. And just so you know, I've heard this more than one time. Could you respond to these concerns and describe to us what the registration process looks like, and is it uniform?
Thanks, Congressman. So the registration process involves manufacturers generating a standardized set of data. It's standardized, but the amount of data we'll ask for to register a pesticide on a food use is a higher amount of data than, for example, to register a non-food use like a rodenticide product. But within that category, it's standard, the data that we want. They are required to generate that data. For registration of a chemical, most of the review we do involves the data that is generated. When we're looking at existing chemicals, it often involves not only the information generated by the manufacturer, but information that may have been generated by all sorts of entities, information from the literature, peer-reviewed, information from sources other than the manufacturer. For new chemicals, though, that likely the only data you're going to have is what the manufacturer generated. So the process that we use in doing risk assessment involves looking at all available information. As I said, most of that is going to be manufacturer-generated, but not exclusively, and then making judgments about how to apply the standards we have for robust science to that data to perform risk assessments.
Okay. I appreciate that response. And just wanted to make sure you were aware of some of those concerns in the process. Certainly, as a specialty crop producer, sometimes we feel like we're overshadowed by the special crops, and the focus and attention certainly is important to us, and we appreciate expediting as much as possible the process.
Well, if I could say, one of the very good collaborations we have is with the Department of Agriculture and their IR4 program, which is designed to basically provide the residue data necessary to support minor use registrations, which we give a very high priority to.
Good. Good. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time, and thank you for recognizing special crops once again. I want to thank both of you again. I've just got a couple more questions that, because I'm here the entire time, I usually wait rather than make my colleagues have to wait around for us to get through a line of questioning, and then we can actually, get a few ends tied up, and we'll get you out of here. Mr. Jones and Dr. Johansson, there's actually legislation that's been introduced that would suspend the registration of neonics and establish a new standard for pesticide registration. Mr. Jones, can you tell us what impact you think this would have on farmers' yields and, more importantly, global food security?
We have not evaluated what would happen in the event of a removal of neonicotinoids as a class of pesticides. So I really can't speak with any degree of authority on that question.
And Dr. Johansson, can you?
Well, certainly we would see producers switch to other classes of pesticides in that case, and so we would need to evaluate the relative effectiveness and cost of those other types of treatments. But certainly we would expect that producers would find an alternative. It's just a question of how costly that would be. We'd need to evaluate that, but I wouldn't suspect that we would see, other than the case of potentially places where there isn't alternatives or isn't as effective alternatives, a huge decrease in production, just probably an increase in costs.
Okay. And Dr. Johansson, your testimony discusses the need for public-private partnerships and increased citizen engagement to promote pollinator health. And I've promoted public-private partnerships in other issues, including water infrastructure on another committee that I serve on. And I'm interested in what the task force is actually developing here. Can you provide a preview of what you're working on with P3s, or keep this committee updated on the particular issue, even though I'd rather that last statement not be an out for you not to have to answer?
Yes, I have to follow up with you on that.
You
Certainly.
took the out.
Yeah. We'll make sure to get you that information.
In a couple weeks?
In a couple of weeks, definitely.
How about a week?
Well, I'll see what I can shake loose when I get back to 1400 Independence.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm going to go ahead and go into the closing statement. And before we adjourn, do you have any other questions, Mr. Newhouse? Well, again, thank you to both of you for being here today. This hearing was able to get a lot of questions asked on very important issues. Again, we have a concern at this subcommittee over the lack of communication between your agencies and between other agencies within the same administration. Now, I know, Dr. Johansson, you were being very kind in many of your comments in regards to decisions made specifically on the issue relating to the EPA's decision on soybeans, but you do say specifically in your letter that the USDA disagrees with the EPA's decision. I think that disagreement could have been avoided with a little bit of communication. And we're going to continue to have hearings like this to talk about a lack of communication if we don't feel that this task force is coming together and continuing to work. So take this message back and let them know, let your superiors know. We really appreciate you spending the time here to answer our questions. You get to be on the front lines of getting our frustration sometimes. And both of you, I truly do appreciate the time that you spent in front of this subcommittee. And Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any questions posed by a member. The Subcommittee on Biotechnology, Horticulture, and Research is now adjourned.